When it comes to most of my video essays, it's usually on why I really like something, most of the time it being an underrated project that I want to give recognition to, or it's something I actively dislike and feel there's a lot to be said on why said album doesn't work on so many levels. These videos, while difficult to make, are in the end pretty feasible due to how frequent I visit them and I try to dissect them from every angle. So today, I'm going to try something different and talk about an album I have very strong feelings towards, but can't nail a direct opinion on. That being Eric Church's The Outsiders. So in case you don't know, Chief was my very first Eric Church record, as was for a lot of people, and spoiler alert, it's great. I loved the grit the album possessed, how down to earth it was at times, and Eric began to show far more songwriting prowess than he ever did on his previous work. I was pretty interested in the guy and wanted more from him, and I got some with Eric Church's The Outsiders, and oh my god, it was so good! I loved everything about this album, the songwriting, the vocals, the rock flair, the jams, the lack of a coherent story, all that stuff. Almost everyone loved it initially and garnered critical acclaim upon its release, but in the years since then, this album hasn't really aged that well, especially in comparison to other projects at the time. A lot of flaws and even just bad tracks began to become the consensus, to the point where this went from everyone's favorite Eric Church record to arguably the worst one, and it still holds that title to this day 3 albums later. And here's the interesting thing. This is such a split opinion for a lot of people. The opinions on this album are so passionately displayed that this is still the best Eric Church record, or this is the worst one. It's the most controversial when it comes to modern fan reception. And as to which side I choose, oh, definitely the worst one. But worst is a pretty ugly word, as I wouldn't call it the worst, as it indicates it's last but bad. I'd rather use the word weakest, as in last but not bad, for a variety of reasons I'd like to get into today. Because here's the thing. I have no idea whether or not this album is good or not anymore. The general opinion from my perspective is that half of these songs suck and half of them don't. And the half that is good is honestly the best collection of songs Eric has ever done besides Mr. Misunderstood. These songs are some of the best country music of the decade. Indie, mainstream, it doesn't matter. They are all just so excellent and well defined, and it's astounding. But on the other hand, the rest of it is the worst collection of Eric Church songs ever put out. And it ain't even close. To which you're asking, well, that's simple enough to explain the album's quality. It's a mixed bag, half good, half bad. And like, yeah, on the surface that's true, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I personally think there are a few more admirable and unadmirable traits to discuss beyond the quality of the two pairings of music. I'm not really here to attack or defend the album, just analyze and draw a conclusion by the end. So let's dive right in. So following up your blockbuster of a release, both critically and financially, is really hard. People have seen what you can do, and now that you've amassed an audience, what do you do now? Follow-ups are incredibly difficult to do when you have a reputation that precedes you, and most often it's easy to take a considerable dive given the bar you've set. Often when someone releases a follow-up, it's constantly compared to what came before and almost always in a negative perception. I began to notice a trend with how Eric released albums. Upon release, people thought it was aggressive rock trash, but given time, people got around to it and began to appreciate it. People didn't really like Sinners Like Me, but after Carolina, it got received better, and Carolina became the new punching bag. And when Chief came along, the same thing happened, and the same with The Outsiders, which sorta broke the cycle but began to age poorly as the months went on. So you'd think, okay, just wait for the next album and people will like it again. It will become the underrated masterpiece diehard fans view it as. But the next album Eric released was Mr. Misunderstood, the most adored and acclaimed Eric Church album of them all, and arguably the most beloved mainstream country album of the decade, Traveler excluded. This album had it all: phenomenal storytelling, gorgeous rock aesthetic, the best production of Jay Joyce's career to a point where it rivals the best of Dave Cobb himself. It took previous concepts set up by The Outsiders and refines them to insane heights. One could argue the sourness left in people's mouths by The Outsiders, and possibly Eric himself, caused him to record the album and release it a little over a year later. And when comparing The Outsiders to Mr. Misunderstood, it honestly made the album look worse, because despite the inherent flaws The Outsiders had, people could imagine what an album could look like if the entire emphasis was on the themes, the balance, and tone. And well, they got it with Mr. Misunderstood. Every flaw and misstep ran out on such a phenomenal release. The Outsiders is between such pivotal moments in Eric's career, and it's not a fair criticism in either direction. Chief is his biggest commercial success, turning him from an underrated talent to one of the big dogs, and Mr. Misunderstood is his biggest critical success, the album that garnered him widespread acclaim and accolades. But what does this album have despite it coming out between these two behemoths? As a follow-up, this album is definitely mixed for me because on one hand, the fact that the Outsiders actually went for the themes it did is the reason Mr. Misunderstood exists. The parental themes stem from this album, and while yes, they are expanded upon in greater lengths, you can't really credit Mr. Misunderstood for being this brand new thing Eric was going for, because it really wasn't. This album actually started that, with a lot of the themes being directly referenced in Dark Side, which is one of the best Chief songs there is. And one could even argue that Joint, which is possibly the worst Eric Church song there is. Wow, what a parallel! As for progression of music, well, it just keeps delving deeper and deeper into this rock sound, and while one could just say this was a rock record, yeah, it pretty much is, but Eric didn't care about that. Around the time of the release, Eric said genres are essentially dead, going off how they're more so brand extensions first and actual musical lens second. To which I respond, yep, pretty much. In all honesty, how many of the releases the past few years are genuinely country albums? Even for the indie crowd, that number is shockingly minimal given how much genres intersect. So while I view the Outsiders as rock, I don't really hate him for this. With that said, this album delving into rock as much as it did really felt like the straw that broke the camel's back. Ever since Sinners, more and more had Eric delved into the rock and even metal side, but after this point, that exponential reach into the field stopped. Mr. Misunderstood and Desperate Man didn't go that route and pursued different musical avenues overall. The Outsiders felt like the point where he had realized he may have gone too far in some places. The aggression of songs like The Outsiders and That Damn Rock and Roll ceased for far more calmer and controlled songs. Even when he does let loose in songs like Mistress Named Music or Knives in New Orleans, they felt calculated and properly structured, and for a lot of this album, I gotta admit, it doesn't feel that way. So I'm glad this album walked so others can run. It really feels like it's crawling in the grand scheme of things. One criticism I always see levied against this album is that it's the moment Eric went bro country. And like, there's a lot of shit you can say about the Outsiders, but every time I see someone spout that bull, it rubs me the wrong way. Admittedly, the quality of a fair amount of the songs are on the level of bro country, but it just being called that makes it look worse. And for a lot of people, it makes sense. This album came out in 2014, the same year all this shit hit radio. And the album is so heavily influenced by rock, it's obviously a bro album, no. Now, while there isn't an official classification of bro country, I define it as music influenced by country-esque rock and hip-hop elements and subject matter surrounding party themes. Okay, so I just checked and turns out there's actually a Wikipedia article that gives a way better definition, so... I mean, it essentially is the same thing, so it doesn't really matter. And these things don't equate in the slightest. If anything, The Outsiders is the anti-bro country album. A fair portion of the album is focused on romanticism and heartbreak, and despite the execution and presentation of those themes, the themes themselves aren't bro country. They focus on the sexualization of women, whereas Eric focuses on the joys and pains that can be brought from a partner in some pretty unique ways. Having them leave and him comparing a cold one having more meaning than the girl leaving being a cold move. Or how his devotion to his wife is like a broke record. That Damn Rock and Roll is about differentiating the meaning of true rock from the bro landscape we lived in. And Devil Devil Prelude adds to those themes by enveloping us in this intense landscape that is Nashville. Not the music city where happy country dreams are made, Nashville, the corporation, which is where a lot of these bro artists and albums were churned out of. And ever since, we got wider interpretations of the Nashville scene with artists like Randy Houser and his album Magnolia. If you want to say The Outsiders is one of the worst albums of the decade, by all means, go ahead. But please, for the love of God, don't taint its legacy with this bullshit. Even in the musical aspect, computing the sonic direction of bro to The Outsiders is just asinine. This album actually goes the distance in providing a strong and full rock sound. The opening jumps around with a lot of rhythms and styles in the final portions. Can you honestly think of a bro country song that even tried that? Production-wise is where I think the album sort of falters, as I think it's Jay Joyce's weakest project to date, but compared to the bro producers at the time, it would honestly be some of their best work. Whereas bro country was just a cheap imitation of rock greats, Eric's band was actually passionate about what they were doing, even if they failed spectacularly in my eyes. But hey, let's get into that. I've been building up to this portion as it's easily the most disappointing aspect of this album, the musical presentation. On paper, the premises of these songs, in my opinion, are all solid. Some are trying as hard as others, but none of them are truly a detriment to the project. They are A-okay in my book. The problem arises when you realize this is the worst presentation of any Eric Church album ever. Now look, I'm not tainting the 5 tracks I adore because in my eyes they knock it out of the park. They are carefully calculated and phenomenal songs in terms of their sonic direction. Everything else is decent at best to holy crap kill me now, this is torture. And this all becomes clear with the opening track where Eric really was heading down the rabbit hole. The Outsider's self-titled track is such a clear sign of Eric not really knowing exactly what he was doing. The intro and first impact are solid enough, but from the stomp clap sequence onward, this song just falls apart, and when we reach the end, none of this even makes sense anymore. It genuinely felt like Eric just was throwing random shit at the wall and absolutely none of it was sticking. Cold One is the culmination of the douchey side of Eric cultivating mass since his first release, and even in those moments on previous records, I still find them fun and lighthearted, but here Eric just comes off incredibly annoying, and dare I say, this is the first time Eric really sounded derivative. Roller Coaster Ride, honestly, I don't even know what this song is from a musical standpoint. It's the song that stands out the most and not in a good way. I've seen some people claim this is when Eric went pop for the first time, and I mostly agree with that. Its soulless sonic palette is only rivaled by Hell of a View. Broke Record is a bit of a mixed bag, as the douchebag presentation sort of works for me here. I don't really have a technical reason as to why that is, it just does. But for the instrumentals, it's like everyone says, it's monotonous and frankly uninspired. That's Damn Rock and Roll is quite possibly the most generic AC/DC ripoff I've seen in recent memory. I know this song has its fans, but I'm not one of them. It's one thing to have influences from others, but this is just ripping someone off, plain and simple. And for the rest of the tracks, it just goes deeper and deeper into the madness. Devil Devil Prelude is just utter insanity from every avenue. It's like Eric's band and Jay Joyce said, fuck it, let's make the most horrid abomination imaginable. Nothing matters anymore, musical sanity doesn't matter, just buckle up and enjoy the ride. This was the point in The Outsiders where it really began to sour in my eyes a lot. For the most part, the album is incredibly inconsistent and just dropping random musical sides to church that are frankly unnecessary. And this song itself is a culmination in how this album didn't feel like a precise vision and just abstract, and not in a good way, as there's no connective tissue with frankly anything, even with the songs I really do like. Oh, and also the joint sucks, like, as Prelude pretty much makes that fact blatant. This song is essentially an afterthought, but hey, I've been pretty cruel to this album. Let's actually talk about the music I do like. Holy shit, this music is so good, I can't believe my eyes. Not really sure if this is a compliment or not, but the actually good songs are spread pretty evenly throughout the album. So even if you're stuck with a bad song, chances are a good one's around the corner. After the incredibly underwhelming The Outsiders, A Man Who Was Gonna Die Young really tries its hardest to tug at your heartstrings. I'm not usually that impressed by songs about the struggle of mortality from people in their prime health-wise, but there's just something about the compelling lyricism and sorrow Eric displays that's just immensely powerful. Maybe it's because it actually deals with Eric at the age he currently was at the time rather than him singing if he was an old man in the scenario. I don't know. Talladega takes such a profound look at friendship and bringing us into this world of racing. I'm not into racing, so if there's any references in it, they went over my head. Even without them, the song is just great in general. A killer song I'm never tired of revisiting. I'm pretty clear Sex Jam equals not good for me, but like a Wrecking Ball is the exception. I may have a bias against them, but Eric puts in the effort in pulling off a smooth, soulful, and just fantastic Sex Jam that's just a ton of fun from a vocal standpoint. Dark Side, in my opinion, is the peak of the album and an S tier of a song. The way the intensity grows despite the musical aspect staying relatively the same just blows me away. This is Eric putting maximum effort into the lyrical department and letting it enhance everything else rather than it being the other way around. And Give Me Back Your Hometown, while the weakest of the great songs, is still, well, great. A sundering breakup anthem that just keeps building and building until Eric lets it rip in the climax. Oh my god, it's so good. I could rag on the cliche boom clap sequence, but in the end, I don't care at all. It's amazing all around. All of these songs are amazing and make you kind of forget about everything else this album offers. It makes the decision of whether this album is good or not inherently difficult because we're not just dealing with a bunch of okay or pretty good songs. This is near the pinnacle of Eric's career in nearly every avenue, and weighing the pros and the cons are just so hard. There was one review for the album that really stuck out to me from Anthony Easton and Pop Matters, and essentially he says that Eric, despite all his efforts on this record, will never be an outsider no matter how hard he tries, but can sell the outsider image of himself greatly. It's a thing even Trigger from Saving Country Music touched upon a little bit, and honestly, I agree. This is the album that tried so hard to make Eric seem like this edgy and daring person, and with these songs, they rather set that image back rather than bring it forward. The opening track insists on Eric being this dark man who lives on the outsides of the country genre, but in my opinion, it comes off more of a joke than an actual declaration. And even going back to Devil Devil Prelude, he attacks Nashville, which is commendable, sure, but Eric is a part of Nashville. He isn't an outlaw producing his record for an indie label. He made songs designated for radio and commercial appeal. Sure, there's a lot of artistic willingness present, but none of it screams outlaw or outsider or whatever you want to call him. He is part of the industry, whether he likes it or not. He may have been portrayed as an outsider during the Sinners and Carolina era, but from Chief and onward, you're a star built up by the country scene. And frankly, you're as much of an outsider as someone like Dan and Shay is. And for a lot of people, that's just a hypocritical stance Eric takes on a lot of this record. To put it in other words, it would be like me saying I'm a country critic. Well, I'm not. I live in New Jersey and there's nothing country about me. I'm just a critic who likes country music. I'm fascinated with the traditions it displays musically and the heartfelt stories people give, but no matter how many albums I listen to, I'm not a country person. The same applies here. Eric could make the most daring and rock album ever, but no matter how hard he tries, he's not an outsider. But there's another way to look at this. One thing I didn't really touch upon throughout this video is the narrative, or really just the message this album sends. What exactly is it? Is there even a message? Well, according to Eric, there is. He doesn't want you to shuffle it or there'll be consequences. Whatever you do, don't shuffle the Outsiders. Worst mistake of my life. But one has to ask, what even is the story of the Outsiders? This is a topic I've never seen anyone cover whatsoever, and I've been pondering this for years now. And I think I've reached an answer. Well, not as much of an answer, but more so theory, as this is just merely my interpretation of the record. The Outsiders isn't about making Eric Church an outsider. It's about phasing him out of this era of his life. Really think about it. Remember when this album takes place on the album timeline. Chief was his most rock-oriented album before this release, and Mr. Misunderstood is the calmest and most controlled of any of his releases. It feels all too intentional, because to me, this album is deconstructing this idea and image that Eric Church represents. It's about rejecting the mythos of Eric Church. To put it in perspective, look at the opening of The Outsiders. It opens with what is far and away the most aggressive song on the album. The blaring guitars and harsh tone really try to make it sink into you that this will be a more heavy experience. And what song follows this? A Man Who Was Gonna Die Young, the most light in terms of its musical elements and the heaviest in its subject matter. It lets us know that we're not here for Eric Church the outsider. We're here for Eric Church the man. Need more proof? Look at how Mr. Misunderstood opens. Essentially, these two songs are the same message, acknowledging differences in ourselves and being proud of it. But which is the song that's saying more? At this point, the whole facade of Eric being this on-the-edge, underrated star is gone, and Eric Church, the emotionally complex individual, kicks in. Now, am I saying this story is achieved perfectly? Absolutely not. Despite the story and frankly excellent songs conveying this, it does not make up for the sheer annoyance and outright bad moments this album offers, and certainly doesn't paint those songs in a more positive light, and if anything, actually makes them worse. Because now that you know the masterpiece that's being visualized, you hate it more as it wasn't as fleshed out and realized as it could be. And I think that's a good way to wrap this up. No matter how I may view it later down the line, I'll always have fond memories of this album and the enjoyment I've gotten out of it. But with that said, the low points of this are incredibly rough and even impossible to get through at times. Not only that, but it loses a lot of what the album is going for in both the narrative and musical directions. Some albums for Eric aren't particularly story-driven albums like Chief and Carolina, but allow for incredibly fun and sincere moments to shine through consistently. And albums like Mr. Misunderstood and Desperate Man allow for their plot points to develop and build into incredibly satisfying moments. The Outsiders doesn't really land in either of these categories. The narrative is solid, but the execution of said narrative is where I and a lot of people really draw the line with this record, and more people are prone to just listen to the songs they like and skip the rest, which you can honestly do due to a lot of the songs not capable of going to anywhere compelling or really interesting from a musical standpoint, and you don't really need any of them except for probably the opening track, which makes it so easy to say that this was a mixed bag and was just mediocre in the end, with exceptional songs and not so interesting rock songs that lose their luster over the years or were never good to begin with. This is such an easy album to hate as its problems are significant and easy to catch and rag on, making it an even steeper task to go over what this album actually got right. And it got a ton of things right, of which would become the most exemplary moments in the past decade of country music. I'm prone to dunking on albums I grew up with due to their lackluster nature, but I wholeheartedly believe that Eric Church's The Outsiders is a decent album. And the 5 main songs is some of the very best music Eric Church will probably ever offer. I hesitate to call it great or overall on the level of some of the best Eric projects like Chief or Desperate Man. It's not as good as I want it to be, but offers moments in music that easily outshines both of them and will stay with me forever. And at least for me, it's worthwhile going through the junk to experience this admittedly greatly flawed, misunderstood experience. None of the Eric Church albums are perfect, even Mr. Misunderstood. I just don't like when people actively shit on this and never highlight the amazing portions it offered. It's still the weakest Eric Church album, there's no getting around that, but when an album still manages to offer this much greatness, I just think that goes to show just how phenomenal of an artist Eric Church really is.